The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt, sending dust swirling through the mountain air. Elizabeth Winters clutched her small valise with trembling fingers as the driver called out their arrival. 22 years old, former schoolteacher from Boston, and now a mail-order bride traveling to meet a man who had only seen her photograph taken before the fire. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped down onto the dirt road of Silver Creek, Colorado. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Last stop, miss, the driver announced, handing down her single trunk. Welcome to Silver Creek. Elizabeth adjusted her bonnet carefully, making sure the wide brim shadowed the left side of her face. The thin veil she had added provided additional coverage, a barrier between her scarred features and the curious stares of strangers. The small mining town sprawled before her, a collection of wooden buildings clinging to the mountainside like scattered children's blocks. Mr. James Blackwood, her husband-to-be, had described himself as a successful businessman in the growing frontier town. His letters had been polite, even charming, detailing the comfortable life awaiting a suitable wife willing to leave the comforts of the East for the promise of the West. Elizabeth had responded with carefully worded letters of her own, sharing her background as a teacher, her love of literature, her skills in household management. What she hadn't shared was the fire that had destroyed her family home 6 months earlier, leaving her face permanently marked and her prospects in Boston permanently diminished. You must be Miss Winters. A well-dressed man approached, his smile faltering as he drew closer. I'm James Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, Elizabeth acknowledged with a small nod, keeping her face angled away. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. His eyes narrowed as he studied her, attempting to see beneath the strategically positioned veil. Your photograph didn't show you wearing a veil. The photograph was taken some time ago, Elizabeth replied. Softly, circumstances have changed since then, I see. His tone suggested he didn't see it all, but was determined to maintain polite appearances in the public street. Well, let's get you settled. We can discuss changes in private. The walk to Blackwood's home was mercifully short. Elizabeth felt the stares of townspeople as they passed, the whispers beginning as soon as they thought themselves out of earshot. Silver Creek was the largest settlement for 50 miles, but it was still small enough that a newcomer attracted attention, especially when arriving to marry one of the town's prominent citizens. Blackwood's house stood apart from the others, a 2-story structure with glass windows and a freshly painted porch. In another life, Elizabeth might have felt relief at this evidence of comfort and stability. Now she merely felt the growing knot of dread in her stomach as they stepped inside and closed the door on public scrutiny. Now, Miss Winters, Blackwood sighed, his polite facade dropping away. Perhaps you could explain why the woman who arrived looks nothing like the woman in the photograph I received. With steady hands that belied her racing heart, Elizabeth unpinned her bonnet and removed the veil. The gasp that escaped Blackwood's lips was familiar to her now, the sharp intake of breath she had heard from everyone who first saw what the fire had done to her. The left side of her face bore the mapped evidence of flames, ridged skin that stretched from her temple to her jaw, pulling slightly at the corner of her eye and mouth. Her left ear was partially missing, and patches of her chestnut hair refused to grow along her scarline. The damage wasn't as horrific as some she had seen in the hospital where she had recovered, but it was enough to transform her from a marriage prospect to an object of pity or revulsion in Boston society. My God, Blackwood whispered, taking an involuntary step backward. What happened to you? A fire, Elizabeth answered simply. 6 months ago. My family's home burned in the night. I was trapped when the staircase collapsed. My parents did not survive. For a moment, something like compassion flickered across Blackwood's face, quickly replaced by calculation. And you didn't think this was information I should have before? You traveled all the way here? Before I paid for your passage? Would you have still wanted me if you had known? Elizabeth asked, already knowing the answer. That's hardly the point, he blustered, pacing the polished wooden floor. This is fraud, Miss Winters. I paid for a bride, not damaged goods. The words stung, though Elizabeth had prepared herself for rejection. Still, the journey west had depleted her meager savings. She had sold everything she owned to start a new life, gambling that a man desperate enough for a wife might see beyond her scars. She had lost that gamble. I apologize for the deception, she said, gathering her dignity around her like armor. I can repay your investment in my passage once I find employment. Blackwood laughed, a harsh sound in the well-appointed room. Employment? In Silver Creek? Looking like that? The schoolteacher position is filled. The respectable establishments won't hire someone who would frighten the customers. Unless you're considering the brothel down by the mines. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe. To our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I am a teacher, Mr. Blackwood, Elizabeth said firmly. I will find a way to support myself honorably. Not in my house, you won't, he replied coldly. I've worked too hard building my reputation in this town. By morning, I want you gone. Where am I supposed to go? The question escaped before she could stop it, a crack in her carefully maintained composure. That's hardly my concern. Blackwood adjusted his waistcoat, already dismissing her from his thoughts. There's a boarding house near the church. Perhaps they'll take pity on you. You can stay in the guest room tonight, but I want no awkward questions from the neighbors about who you are or why you're here. That night, in the small guest room of the house that was supposed to become her home, Elizabeth allowed herself the luxury of tears. She had gambled everything on this fresh start, believing that in a frontier town where women were scarce, her education and domestic skills might outweigh her damaged appearance. She had been wrong. Tomorrow she would face the daunting task of finding shelter and employment in a town where she knew no one, where her arrival had already sparked curious whispers, and where her connection to one of the town's leading citizens had been severed before it truly began. Her savings would provide a week's lodging at most. After that, Elizabeth forced her thoughts away from that precipice. She had survived the fire that claimed her parents and their home. She had endured the pitying glances and whispered comments. In Boston, she had crossed half a continent alone. She would find a way to survive here too, scarred face or not. Morning arrived with dismal gray skies and a light drizzle that matched Elizabeth's spirits. She dressed carefully in her second-best dress, arranged her bonnet to provide maximum coverage, and pinned her veil in place. The small trunk and valise contained everything she owned in the world: 2 dresses, undergarments, a nightgown, her mother's silver-backed hairbrush, a worn Bible, and 3 precious books that had been gifts from her father. The weight was manageable, but the distance to the boarding house Blackwood had mentioned seemed to stretch endlessly through the muddy streets. Blackwood himself was conspicuously absent when Elizabeth descended the stairs. Only the housekeeper acknowledged her presence, sliding a plate of toast and eggs across the kitchen table with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Mr. Blackwood said to tell you he had business in town this morning, the woman explained, watching Elizabeth struggle to eat with dignity while keeping her veil arranged. He left this for your lodging. She placed a small envelope beside the plate. The envelope contained enough money for 3 nights at a modest boarding house. Not generosity, Elizabeth recognized, but insurance against gossip. Enough time for her to disappear from Silver Creek without becoming a subject of scandal that might attach itself to James Blackwood's carefully cultivated reputation. Thank you, Elizabeth said, tucking the envelope into her pocket. Could you direct me to the boarding house near the church? The housekeeper's expression grew uncomfortable. Mrs. Sullivan's place? It's respectable enough, but she hesitated. Mr. Blackwood spoke to Reverend Hayes this morning. The Reverend's wife runs the place, and they're full. Up just now, of course. Blackwood had ensured she wouldn't find shelter in the most obvious place. Elizabeth swallowed her disappointment. Is there another boarding house in town? There's Mrs. Keller's place down by the assayer's office, the housekeeper offered reluctantly. Not as fancy, but she takes in laundry from the miners. Might be she'd have a room. Elizabeth thanked the woman, gathered her meager belongings, and stepped out into the drizzling morning. Silver Creek looked considerably less charming in the gray light. Muddy streets rutted with wagon wheels, weathered buildings with peeling paint, and the ever-present mountains looming above, disappearing into low clouds. The mining town had boomed several years earlier with a silver strike, but the easy riches had been claimed long ago. Now it survived on the harder-won ore that required deeper mining and more labor. Mrs. Keller's boarding house proved to be a narrow, two-story building wedged between a hardware store and a smoky saloon. The landlady herself answered Elizabeth's knock, a stout woman with graying hair and hands reddened from lye soap and hot water. "Room's $2 a week," she announced without preamble, eyeing Elizabeth's trunk. "Breakfast and supper included. No gentlemen visitors, no liquor, and I don't abide tardiness at mealtimes." "That's acceptable," Elizabeth said, relief washing through her. "I can pay for 1 week in advance." Mrs. Keller nodded briskly. Top of the stairs, last door on the right. Bathroom shared, at the end of the hall. She hesitated, her eyes fixed on Elizabeth's veil. "I don't mean to pry, miss, but we're plain-speaking folk here. Whatever you're hiding under that veil won't shock me more than what I've seen in 30 years on the frontier." Elizabeth's hand trembled slightly as she unpinned the veil. Mrs. Keller's expression remained unchanged as she studied the scarred face before her. "Fire?" she asked simply. "Yes, 6 months ago." Mrs. Keller nodded. "My late husband had worse from a mining accident. You'll find folks here have seen their share of injuries and hardship. They might stare at first, but they'll get used to you quick enough." She turned toward the kitchen. "Supper's at 6. Don't be late." The small attic room was sparsely furnished. A narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked mirror, a straight-back chair, and a hook on the wall for hanging clothes. The sloped ceiling made it impossible to stand upright, except in the center of the room, and the single window looked out on the alley behind the building. It was a far cry from the comfortable home she had anticipated as Mrs. Blackwood, but it was shelter. Elizabeth unpacked her few belongings, arranging her books on the windowsill and placing her mother's hairbrush on the washstand. The familiar objects provided small comfort in her unfamiliar surroundings. She had shelter for a week. Now she needed to find employment before her meager funds ran out. The next morning, Elizabeth began her search for work. With her veil firmly in place, she visited the general store, the hotel, and even the assayer's office, offering her services as a clerk, housekeeper, or assistant. Each time, the initial interest in an educated woman from the East faded as soon as her circumstances became clear. No one said directly that her scarred face was the problem, but the evasive responses and uncomfortable glances told her everything. By mid-afternoon, Elizabeth's spirit was flagging. She stood on the boardwalk outside the town's only dressmaker, having just received another polite rejection, when she noticed a weathered sign hanging from a post outside a small cabin at the edge of town. H. Mackenzie, Furs and Supplies. The cabin sat apart from the main street, backing up against the pine forest that climbed the mountainside. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and stacked firewood lined one wall. Unlike the other businesses in town, there was nothing welcoming about the place. No display window showing wares, no painted sign advertising specials or services. Just the simple wooden placard with its brief declaration. Elizabeth hesitated. A fur trapper would hardly need the services of a former schoolteacher. Yet something about the isolated cabin called to her, perhaps because it like her, existed on the periphery of Silver Creek society. The door creaked as she pushed it open, releasing the rich smell of tanned leather, wood smoke, and pine. The interior was dimly lit, with pelts hanging from the rafters and shelves laden with supplies, ammunition, traps, knives, and packages wrapped in oilcloth. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, beside it a work table covered with tools and partially completed projects. "Hello?" Elizabeth called, peering into the shadows. "Is anyone here?" A rustling came from behind a curtained doorway at the back, followed by heavy footsteps. A man emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and hair that brushed his collar. He wore a buckskin jacket over a wool shirt, and a knife hung from his belt. His weathered face suggested a man in his 30s who had spent most of those years outdoors. "Can I help you?" His voice was deep, but not unfriendly. His eyes curious as they took in her veiled appearance. "I hope so," Elizabeth said, summoning her courage. "I'm looking for work. I saw your sign and thought perhaps—" "Not looking for help," he interrupted, turning back to a fox pelt stretched on his work table. "Town's got plenty of businesses. That might need a woman's touch. Try the hotel." "I've tried the hotel," Elizabeth replied, frustration lending strength to her voice. "I've tried every establishment in Silver Creek. No one will hire me." Something in her tone made him turn back, studying her more carefully. "Why not? You look capable enough." Elizabeth hesitated, then slowly unpinned her veil. If he was going to reject her, better to get it over with quickly. "This is why." The trapper's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't gasp or look away as others had done. Instead, he studied her face with the same careful attention he might give to assessing a pelt or examining a trap. "Fire?" he asked simply. "Yes." He nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "People can be cruel about things they don't understand." He turned back to his work. "Still, I've got no need for help. I work alone." Elizabeth should have left then, accepting yet another rejection. Instead, she found herself looking around the cabin with a critical eye. The place was functional but desperately needed organization. Dust-covered surfaces not actively in use. Paperwork was stacked haphazardly on a small desk in the corner. The living area visible through the curtained doorway appeared equally chaotic. "Your account books are a disaster," she observed, gesturing to the cluttered desk. "And I imagine your correspondence with suppliers and customers is equally neglected." The trapper's head snapped up, surprise and irritation crossing his features. "My books work fine for my needs, do they?" Elizabeth challenged, moving toward the desk. "May I?" Without waiting for permission, she opened the ledger on top of the stack. The entries were legible but inconsistent, with missing dates and unclear notations. "How do you know if you're making a profit? How do you track which pelts sell best in which markets?" A scowl darkened his face. "I know my business, miss. Winters, Elizabeth Winters." She closed the ledger. "And I know mine. I was a teacher before the fire. I'm educated, organized, and in need of employment. Your business needs proper bookkeeping and correspondence. It seems we could help each other." "I don't need help," he insisted, though with less conviction. "When did you last reply to this?" Elizabeth held up a letter from a merchant in Denver, dated 3 months earlier. "He's offering better prices than your current buyer in Central City, according to these receipts." The trapper, Mackenzie, she presumed, stared at her for a long moment. "You figured that out just now?" "It wasn't difficult. The information was all here, just disorganized." A reluctant smile tugged at his beard. "You're persistent, Miss Winters. Desperation breeds persistence, Mr. Mackenzie." "Hugh," he corrected. "Hugh Mackenzie." He wiped his hands on a rag and considered her with narrowed eyes. "I can't pay much, and it would only be a few hours each day when I'm in town, which isn't often this time of year. Fall trap lines need checking." Hope fluttered in Elizabeth's chest. Whatever you can pay would help. I have a room at Mrs. Keller's boarding house, but my funds will only last another few days. Hugh nodded slowly. $2 a week. 4 hours each day, organizing this mess. He gestured to the desk. After that, we'll see. It wasn't enough to cover her room and board, but it was a start. Elizabeth extended her hand. Thank you, Mr. Mackenzie. When would you like me to begin? His large hand engulfed hers in a brief, firm handshake. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. He paused, then added gruffly, and you can leave the veil off. Makes no difference to me what you look like, as long as you can read and write and add a column of figures. Elizabeth left the trapper's cabin with the first genuine smile. Since arriving in Silver Creek, the employment was modest and the pay inadequate, but it was a foothold, a chance to prove her worth based on her skills rather than her appearance. As she walked back toward Mrs. Keller's boarding house, her step was lighter despite the continued stares from townspeople she passed. That evening at supper, Elizabeth mentioned her new position to Mrs. Keller, who raised her eyebrows in surprise. Mackenzie hired you. That's unexpected. Man barely speaks 2 words together when he comes to town for supplies. He needs help with his accounts, Elizabeth explained, buttering a slice of bread. His bookkeeping is creative, Mrs. Keller snorted. I imagine so. Mountain men aren't known for their penmanship. She studied Elizabeth thoughtfully. You be careful up there alone with him. He's got a reputation as a loner, that one. Been in these mountains for 10 years at least. Comes and goes with the seasons. Folks respect him for his skills, but he's not what you'd call sociable. I'll be fine, Elizabeth assured her. He seems direct, but not unkind. Mrs. Keller didn't look convinced. Well, it's good you found something. Though it won't be enough to cover your room and meals. I know. I'll keep looking for additional work. Mrs. Keller wiped her hands on her apron, considering. I could use help with the laundry. It's hard work, but if you're willing, I could apply the earnings toward your board. Between that and Mackenzie's pay, you might just manage. Relief washed over Elizabeth. I would be very grateful, Mrs. Keller. Don't thank me yet, the landlady warned. Wait until you've seen what miners' clothes look like after a week underground. Your fine Boston hands won't stay soft for long. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the first real hint of the mountain winter to come. Elizabeth dressed carefully in her plainest dress, leaving her bonnet and veil on the hook by the door. Hugh Mackenzie had made it clear he didn't care about her scars, and she would not begin their working relationship by ignoring his preferences. The walk to his cabin took her past the church, where Reverend Hayes was sweeping the steps. He paused as she approached, his expression shifting from polite greeting to shock as he registered her scarred face. Good morning, Reverend, Elizabeth sighed, keeping her voice pleasant, though her stomach clenched at his poorly disguised stare. Good morning, miss. Winters, Elizabeth Winters. Recognition dawned in his eyes. Ah, yes, Mr. Blackwood mentioned you. I'm afraid our boarding house is quite full at present, but if you're in need of assistance, the church could perhaps. Thank you, but I've secured lodging with Mrs. Keller, Elizabeth interrupted, unwilling to accept charity. And employment as well. Good day, Reverend. She continued walking, feeling his gaze on her back. No doubt her appearance would be discussed at length after Sunday's service, with speculation about her background and circumstances. The thought would have devastated her once. Now she merely quickened her pace toward the trapper's cabin, where at least her scars weren't the primary concern. Hugh Mackenzie was waiting when she arrived. The cabin door opened despite the morning chill. He nodded in approval when he saw her unveiled face. Good. Honesty suits both of us better, he said by way of greeting. The desk is yours. I've pulled out all the account books and correspondence I could find. The all he referred to proved to be a staggering collection of disorganized papers, receipts, letters, and ledgers dating back several years. Elizabeth surveyed the chaos with dismay. "This will take more than 4 hours," she observed. Hugh shrugged, turning back to a beaver pelt he was stretching. "Then it'll take more days. I'm heading up to check my trap lines tomorrow. Won't be back for 3 or 4 days, depending on the weather and what I catch. You can work while I'm gone if you want." "Keys under the stone by the door." Elizabeth stared at him in surprise. "You'd trust me alone in your cabin, with your business records? You hardly know me." He glanced up, his expression unreadable behind his beard. "I'm a fair judge of character, Miss Winters. Had to be, to survive this long in the mountains. You need work. I need organization. Neither of us seems inclined to steal or cheat. Seems simple enough to me." His straightforward assessment was refreshing after the veiled rejections and pitying glances she'd endured since the fire. Elizabeth found herself smiling as she settled at the desk and began sorting the jumbled papers into categories. The morning passed quickly as she established order from chaos. Hugh worked quietly across the room, his strong hands deftly preparing pelts for market. Occasionally she would ask him a question about a particular transaction or supplier receiving brief but informative answers. By midday, she had created a basic filing system and begun reconstructing his financial records for the current year. "You've done more in 4 hours than I would have managed in a month," Hugh observed as she prepared to leave. "Same time tomorrow?" "Yes, though I may continue working while you're checking your traps, if that's still acceptable." He nodded, reaching into his pocket. "Almost forgot, your pay." He pressed $2 into her palm. "For the week, as agreed." Elizabeth stared at the coins. "But I've only worked 1 day, and accomplished a week's worth already." He turned back to his workbench. "See you tomorrow, Miss Winters." As Elizabeth walked back to town, the coins warm in her pocket, she realized she was looking forward to returning to the rustic cabin and its taciturn owner. For the first time since the fire, someone was seeing her skills first and her scars second, or perhaps not at all. The next week established a pattern. Elizabeth would arrive at the cabin at 8 each morning, work until noon organizing Hugh's business affairs, then return to Mrs. Keller's to help with the laundry. Hugh himself came and went, sometimes absent for days checking trap lines in the high country, other times working in the cabin crafting items from the hides and furs he collected. Gradually, Elizabeth brought order to his chaotic business. She created proper ledgers tracking expenses and income, organized his correspondence with buyers in Denver and Central City, and even drafted responses to inquiries that had languished unanswered for months. Hugh seemed impressed with her efficiency, though he expressed it mainly through grunt-like acknowledgments and the occasional nod of approval. What surprised Elizabeth most was how comfortable she felt in his presence. Unlike others who carefully avoided looking at her scarred face or stared with poorly disguised curiosity, Hugh simply accepted her appearance as one fact among many. He treated her with the same direct, unvarnished manner he seemed to apply to everything in his life. As October deepened toward November, the temperature dropped and snow dusted the higher elevations. Elizabeth arrived one morning to find Hugh adding wood to the cabin's massive stone fireplace. "Winter's coming early this year," he observed, straightening up. "You should have a warmer coat for these mountain mornings." Elizabeth touched her thin wool jacket self-consciously. This was sufficient in Boston. "Boston isn't 8,000 feet up in the Rockies," Hugh replied dryly. "Wait here." He disappeared into the back room, returning with a fur-lined leather coat that had seen better days. "My old one. Too small for me now, but should keep you warm enough." Elizabeth hesitated, touched by the unexpected gesture. "I couldn't." "It's practical, not charity," Hugh interrupted, his tone gruff. "Can't have my bookkeeper freezing to death before she finishes sorting out my accounts." The coat was indeed too large, but wonderfully warm. Elizabeth slipped it on. immediately feeling the difference as the fur lining blocked the draft that constantly circulated through the cabin. "Thank you," she said simply. Hugh nodded, already turning back to his work. But Elizabeth noticed his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual, an expression she couldn't quite interpret crossing his weathered features. As she settled at the desk, Elizabeth realized something had shifted between them. The gift of the coat, practical as it might be, represented a level of consideration beyond their strictly business arrangement. Hugh Mackenzie, the solitary mountain trapper, was beginning to see her as more than just a convenient solution to his bookkeeping problems. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. Elizabeth had come west seeking marriage to a man who ultimately rejected her because of her scars. She had not considered the possibility of forming any attachment in Silver Creek, certainly not with a buckskin-clad mountain man who lived half his life in the wilderness. Yet she couldn't deny that she had come to look forward to their morning. Conversations, brief as they were, or the quiet companionship they shared as they worked on their separate tasks. That evening, as she helped Mrs. Keller fold clean laundry, Elizabeth mentioned the coat. "Mackenzie gave you his old coat?" The landlady's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Well, it's merely practical," Elizabeth echoed Hugh's words. "The mornings are getting colder." Mrs. Keller snorted. "That man hasn't given anyone anything in the 10 years he's been coming to town. Trades, sells, and barters, yes. Gives, never." She folded a sheet with practiced efficiency. "He's sweet on you, though he probably doesn't realize it himself yet." "That's absurd," Elizabeth protested, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "He barely knows me." "Knows enough, apparently." Mrs. Keller gave her a shrewd look. "And how do you feel about our local mountain man?" "He's my employer," Elizabeth replied firmly. "Nothing more." But that night, lying in her narrow bed listening to the wind rattle the boarding house windows, Elizabeth found herself wondering what it would be like to be seen as a woman worthy of affection again, not despite her scars, but simply as herself, complete with all her damages and strengths. The thought followed her into dreams filled with mountain forests and a pair of observant eyes that saw far more than she had realized. The next morning, Elizabeth arrived at the cabin to find Hugh preparing for another trip to his trap lines. A fresh dusting of snow had fallen overnight, and he was loading supplies onto a sturdy pack mule tethered outside. "Good morning," she greeted him, pulling his old coat more tightly around her against the chill. "Will you be gone long this time?" 4 days, maybe 5, he replied, securing a canvas pack. "Weather's turning. Need to check the high country traps before the passes fill with snow." He gestured toward the cabin. "Left something on the desk for you. Thought it might help with the accounts." Inside, Elizabeth found a small wooden box on the desk. Opening it revealed a collection of perfectly sharpened pencils, a new ledger book bound in leather, and a small silver letter opener with a handle carved from antler. Practical gifts, certainly, but selected with obvious thought for her work. "These are lovely," she said when Hugh came inside. "Thank you." He shrugged, seeming almost embarrassed by her gratitude. "Ordered them from Denver last month. Finally arrived yesterday." He busied himself checking supplies in his pack. "There's enough firewood stacked by the stove to keep the place warm while you work. Don't want you catching a chill." His concern, gruffly expressed, warmed her more than any fire could. "I'll be fine. Be careful in the mountains." Hugh paused at the door, studying her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "Always am." He hesitated, then added, "Elizabeth, when I return, would you join me for supper?" "Not at the boarding house. Here, I'm a fair hand with venison stew." The invitation surprised her. In the week she had worked for him, they had never shared a meal or spent time together outside of business hours. "I'd like that," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. He nodded, seeming pleased, though his expression remained mostly hidden behind his beard. "Good, Friday then, weather permitting. After he left, Elizabeth found it difficult to concentrate on the accounts. The invitation to dinner kept intruding on her thoughts, along with Mrs. Keller's knowing comments about Hugh being sweet. On her, she had come to Silver Creek expecting to marry a stranger who had rejected her on sight. Now she found herself anticipating a simple meal with a different man entirely, one who had never once made her feel that her scarred face diminished her value. The irony wasn't lost on her. In fleeing the pitying glances of Boston society, she had found acceptance in the most unlikely place, a rough cabin on the edge of civilization, from a man who lived half his life in the wilderness. The days of Hugh's absence passed slowly. Elizabeth continued organizing his business affairs, discovering in the process that he was considerably more successful than his rustic cabin and simple lifestyle suggested. The fur trade had made him quietly wealthy, though he seemed to have little interest in the trappings of prosperity that motivated men like James Blackwood. On Thursday, Elizabeth completed her final task, a comprehensive inventory of his current stock and pending orders. The desk that had once been buried under chaotic piles of paper now held neatly labeled folders, organized ledgers, and a clear system for tracking future transactions. She had transformed his business administration from disorder to efficiency. In less than a month, the realization brought an unexpected pang. With the task complete, he would have no further need of her services. Their business arrangement and the daily interactions she had come to value would naturally conclude. Friday dawned with heavy clouds threatening snow. Elizabeth dressed with unusual care, selecting her best dress, a deep blue wool that complemented her chestnut hair. For the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, she spent time arranging her hair, pinning it so that it partially softened the scarring along her temple and ear. The morning passed with no sign of Hugh. By noon, Elizabeth began to worry that the weather in the mountains had delayed him. At 4 o'clock, with snow beginning to fall in earnest, she reluctantly left the cabin and made her way back to the boarding house. "No sign of your mountain man?" Mrs. Keller asked as Elizabeth stamped snow from her boots in the entryway. "The weather must have delayed him," Elizabeth replied, trying to hide her disappointment. "The high country passes can be treacherous." "This time of year," Mrs. Keller nodded sagely. "Men like Mackenzie know how to read the mountains. He'll wait out the storm if needed." She peered at Elizabeth's carefully arranged hair and best dress. "You look nice. Special occasion?" Elizabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He invited me to supper when he returned." "Just a simple meal." Mrs. Keller's knowing look spoke volumes. "Well, these early winter storms rarely last long. He'll likely be back tomorrow or the next day." But the storm intensified overnight, bringing howling winds and drifting snow that transformed Silver Creek into a landscape of white mounds and narrow pathways dug between buildings. Elizabeth spent Saturday helping Mrs. Keller with indoor chores, trying not to worry about a man who surely knew how to survive mountain winters. By Sunday morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline blue sky and knee-deep snow. Elizabeth attended church services, ignoring the stares and whispers that still followed her in public gatherings. Reverend Hayes preached about inner beauty and God's love for the afflicted, his gaze frequently straying to Elizabeth's scarred face with poorly disguised pity. As the congregation filed out after the service, Elizabeth overheard fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. Trapper's cabin, completely buried. Mackenzie still up in the high country when the storm hit. Organizing a search party, but with the passes snowed in. Heart racing, Elizabeth approached the group of men discussing the situation, the town sheriff, the owner of the general store, and several miners who had come in from their claims before the storm. "Excuse me," she interrupted. "Are you speaking of Hugh Mackenzie?" The men exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable addressing a woman with such visible disfigurement. Finally, the sheriff nodded. "Yes, miss." Mackenzie was due back Friday according to Mrs. Keller. "His cabin's been checked. No sign he made it back before the blizzard. With the amount of snow that fell in the high country, we're concerned he might be trapped somewhere on the trail." "You're organizing a search party?" Elizabeth asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Planning to head out tomorrow morning," one of the miners confirmed. "Weather holds, we'll check the main trails he uses coming down from the trap lines." "I want to help," Elizabeth said firmly, ignoring their surprised expressions. "I know his business records, his usual routes. I might be able to help narrow down where the men exchanged uncomfortable glances at." Elizabeth's request to join the search party. Sheriff Donovan, a graying man with a weathered face, cleared his throat. "Miss Winters, I appreciate your concern, but searching mountain terrain in winter is dangerous work. We need experienced outdoorsmen who know how to handle themselves in these conditions." "I understand that," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her heart. "I'm not suggesting I accompany the search into the high country, but I can help coordinate from town, provide information about which routes Hugh might have taken based on his records." The sheriff considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "Come by my office in an hour. Bring whatever information might help." Elizabeth hurried through the snow to Hugh's cabin, using the key he had entrusted to her. Inside, she quickly located his maps and the journal where he recorded his trapline locations. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the materials. Her mind filled with images of Hugh, alone in the mountains, caught in the sudden ferocity of the winter storm. When she arrived at the sheriff's office, 5 men were already gathered around a rough map spread on the desk. Elizabeth recognized 2 miners, the blacksmith, and a young man who worked at the livery stable. The 5th man, tall and lean with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to wilderness travel, was a stranger to her. "Miss Winters," Sheriff Donovan acknowledged her. "This is Caleb Thornton, arrived last week from Wyoming Territory. He's agreed to help with the search." Thornton's eyes widened briefly at the sight of her scarred face, but to his credit, his expression quickly returned to neutral professionalism. "Ma'am." Elizabeth placed Hugh's maps on the desk. "Mr. Mackenzie has 3 main trap lines in the high country," she explained, pointing to the marked routes. "Based on his ledger entries from last month, I believe he was planning to check the western line this trip. It follows Eagle Creek up toward the ridge." The men leaned in, studying the detailed markings. "There's a line cabin here," Thornton noted, indicating a point near Timber Line. "If he had warning of the storm, he might have holed up there." "That cabin was damaged by a rockslide last spring," Elizabeth said, referring to Hugh's journal. "He hadn't repaired it yet." Thornton looked at her with new respect. "You seem to know his operations well." "I've been organizing his business records for the past month," Elizabeth explained simply. The planning continued for another hour, with Elizabeth providing detailed information from Hugh's journals and maps. A search plan emerged. 3 teams would follow different routes up toward the high country trap lines, carrying emergency supplies and prepared to be out for several days if necessary. "We'll leave at first light," Sheriff Donovan concluded. "Miss Winters, thank you for your assistance. We'll keep you informed of our progress when possible." Elizabeth nodded, fighting back the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Sheriff, one more thing." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object, a carved wooden whistle on a leather cord. "Hugh made this. He said mountain men use them to signal each other in heavy forest or bad weather. The sound carries farther than a voice." The sheriff accepted the whistle, his expression softening. "We'll find him, Miss Winters." That night, sleep eluded Elizabeth. She lay awake in her narrow boarding house bed, listening to the creaking of the old building as it settled in the cold, imagining Hugh somewhere in the vast mountains, possibly injured or trapped by snow. The thought of losing him before she had even begun to understand what he might mean to her was unexpectedly painful. Morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. Elizabeth watched from the church steps as the search party assembled in the pre-dawn. Darkness, loading pack animals with supplies and checking equipment. She had brought coffee and fresh bread from Mrs. Keller's kitchen, a small contribution to their efforts. Sheriff Donovan accepted a mug gratefully. "We'll be back in 3 days, successful or not," he told her. "Can't risk more men in this weather for longer than that." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the harsh realities of mountain survival. "Please, find him," she said simply. As the search party disappeared into the forest trail leading toward the mountains, Elizabeth felt a profound sense of helplessness. For all her organizational skills and knowledge of Hugh's business, she could do nothing now but wait and pray. The town settled into an uneasy routine as the search continued. Elizabeth kept busy helping Mrs. Keller with the boarding house chores and continuing to organize Hugh's business affairs, though there was little left to do. Each evening she would walk to the sheriff's office, hoping for news from any riders who might have returned with updates. On the second day, Caleb Thornton returned alone, his face grim with exhaustion. "Found his trail," he reported to the small group gathered in the sheriff's office. He was heading down from the high country when the storm hit. "Lost the trail. In the heavy snow about 5 miles up, near Carter's Ridge." "That's known avalanche territory," someone murmured. Elizabeth felt her heart constrict. "Are you going back out tomorrow?" Thornton nodded. "First light. Sheriff and the others are maintaining a base camp near where we lost the trail. We've got 1 more day before supplies run too low to continue." That night, Elizabeth made a decision. After helping Mrs. Keller prepare breakfast for the boarding house residents, she approached the landlady with determination. "I need to borrow a horse," she announced. "I'm riding up to join the search base camp." Mrs. Keller stared at her in disbelief. "Have you lost your mind, girl? That's treacherous country, even in good weather. You've no experience with mountain travel." "I won't go beyond the base camp," Elizabeth promised. "But I can't sit here doing nothing while Hugh might be dying up there. I can help with the camp, free up another man for searching." The landlady studied her face, seeing the resolve behind her words. "You care for him that much? A man you've known barely a month?" Elizabeth hadn't allowed herself to examine her feelings too closely, but faced with Mrs. Keller's direct question, she couldn't deny the truth. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." Mrs. Keller sighed heavily. "My nephew works at the livery. I'll speak to him about a horse." "But Elizabeth," her voice softened with genuine concern, "you need to prepare yourself. Men get lost in these mountains every winter. Not all of them are found." "I understand," Elizabeth replied, though her heart refused to accept the possibility. "I still need to try." Dawn found Elizabeth mounted on a steady mountain pony, dressed in Hugh's old coat with additional layers beneath for warmth. Mrs. Keller's nephew, Jamie, had agreed to guide her to the search party's base camp, carrying additional supplies and hot food for the searchers. The trail grew increasingly difficult as they climbed, winding through snow-laden pines and across rocky slopes where the wind had scoured away the snow. Elizabeth's city-bred riding skills were severely tested, but she clung determinedly to the saddle, focusing on the narrow path ahead rather than the dizzying drops to either side. By mid-afternoon, they reached the base camp, 3 canvas tents pitched in a sheltered hollow, with horses picketed nearby and a fire burning in a stone ring. Sheriff Donovan emerged from one tent as they approached, his expression shifting from surprise to disapproval when he recognized Elizabeth. "Miss Winters, this is no place for 'em. I've brought fresh supplies," Elizabeth interrupted, sliding carefully from her saddle. "And I'm here to help maintain the camp so another man can join the search." The sheriff looked ready to argue, then sighed in resignation. "You're as stubborn as your trapper, I'll give you that." He gestured toward the tents. We've got men out on 3 different routes today. They'll return by nightfall." Elizabeth busied herself organizing the supplies they'd brought, then set about improving the camp, melting snow for fresh water, preparing a hot meal for the returning searchers, and ensuring the fire was well maintained. The physical labor kept her mind from dwelling too much on what the men might or might not find in the snow-covered mountains. As dusk approached, searchers began returning to camp in pairs, their expressions telling Elizabeth all she needed to know before they spoke. No sign of Hugh had been found. The mood in camp grew somber as night fell and the temperature dropped. Sharply, "Tomorrow's our last day," Sheriff Donovan announced as they huddled around the fire. "If we don't find him by then, we'll have to call off the search until spring." He didn't need to explain what that meant. By spring, there would be nothing to find but remains. Elizabeth lay awake that night in a borrowed bedroll, listening to the wind moaning through the pines and the occasional cracking of branches under. The weight of snow. Somewhere out in that vast wilderness was Hugh, the man who had looked at her scarred face and seen only a capable woman, who had trusted her with his business and his private thoughts, who had invited her to supper with shy anticipation in his eyes. Morning brought a change in the weather, dark clouds rolling in from the west, promising more snow by afternoon. The search party set out with grim determination, knowing this was their final chance. Elizabeth remained at the base camp with Jamie and one injured searcher who had twisted his ankle the previous day. As the hours passed, Elizabeth found herself repeatedly scanning the forest edge, hoping to see returning searchers with good news. The promised snow began around noon, light flurries that gradually intensified. By mid-afternoon, visibility was reduced to a few hundred yards, and Elizabeth's concern deepened for both Hugh and the men searching for him. "They'll be heading back soon," Jamie assured her, adding wood to the fire. "Sheriff won't risk his men in another blizzard." As if summoned by his words, 2 figures emerged from the swirling snow, Sheriff Donovan and Caleb Thornton, leading their horses through the deepening drifts. Their faces were grim with cold and disappointment. "Nothing," the sheriff reported, warming his hands by the fire. "Checked all the way up to the ridgeline. If he's up there, he's well hidden by snow now." "The others?" Elizabeth asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "On their way back. We split up to cover more ground." Thornton accepted a cup of hot coffee from her grateful hands. "Miss Winters, I'm sorry. We've done everything possible." Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. The finality in his tone made the situation real in a way it hadn't been before. Hugh was gone, lost to the mountains he loved, and she would never know what might have grown between them given time. The snow fell more heavily as the remaining searchers trickled back to camp. With each arrival, Elizabeth's hopes dimmed further. By the time darkness fell, all had returned except one pair, the blacksmith and a miner who had taken the westernmost route along Eagle Creek. "If they're not back by morning, we'll have to send a party looking for them too," the sheriff said. Grimly, "This storm's getting worse by the hour." That night, huddled in her bedroll, Elizabeth finally allowed herself to weep, silent tears for a man she had barely begun to know, yet who had somehow worked his way into her heart through quiet gestures and unspoken understanding. The howling wind seemed to mock her grief, drowning out the small sounds of her sorrow. She must have eventually fallen asleep, for she woke with a start to shouting outside the tent. Fumbling with her boots and Hugh's coat, she emerged into the pre-dawn darkness to find the camp in commotion. Through the still falling snow, she could make out figures approaching, not 2, but 3 men struggling through the drifts, supporting what appeared to be a 4th person between them. "They found someone," Jamie called to her, hurrying to help. Elizabeth's heart leapt into her throat as she ran toward the approaching group, heedless of the deep snow and biting cold. As she drew closer, she could make out the blacksmith and miner supporting a 3rd man between them, a man with a wild beard and familiar buckskin jacket, his head hanging in exhaustion. "Hugh!" The cry tore from her throat before she could stop it. His head lifted at her voice, his eyes finding her across the snowy clearing. Even from a distance, Elizabeth could see the disbelief and wonder in his expression. She reached them. As they entered the camp, her hands automatically reaching out to touch him, to confirm he was real and not a product of desperate hope. Hugh was pale beneath his weathered tan, his right leg bound with makeshift splints, but alive gloriously. Miraculously alive. "Elizabeth," he murmured, his voice hoarse from exposure. "What in God's name are you doing up here?" "Waiting for you," she replied simply, tears freezing on her scarred cheek. They helped Hugh to the fire, where Sheriff Donovan and Thornton immediately began assessing his injuries. The blacksmith explained how they had found him, sheltered in a rocky overhang near the creek, his leg broken from a fall on the icy trail, surviving on melted snow and a few emergency rations. "Heard the whistle," Hugh confirmed weakly, nodding toward the carved wooden signal the sheriff had carried. "Couldn't believe my ears at first." While the men prepared a stretcher for the journey back to town, Elizabeth knelt beside Hugh, her hands busying themselves tucking blankets around him, checking his splints, anything to keep contact with him. "You shouldn't have come up here," he chided gently. "Too dangerous." "I couldn't stay in town and do nothing," she replied. "Not when you were missing." Hugh's gloved hand caught hers, stilling her nervous movements. "Why?" The question was simple but loaded with meaning. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily, all pretense falling away in the face of how close she had come to losing him forever. "Because you saw me, Hugh. Not my scars, not what happened to me, but me. And somehow, without meaning to, I started seeing you too." A smile creased his bearded face, transforming it despite the pain and exhaustion etched there. "Been seeing you since the day you walked into my cabin and started ordering my life around, Elizabeth Winters. Just wasn't sure you'd ever see anything worthwhile in a rough mountain man like me." "I see everything worthwhile," she whispered, her hand tightening around his. The journey back to Silver Creek was slow and difficult, with the men taking turns pulling the improvised sled carrying Hugh through the snow. Elizabeth rode beside him, watching for signs of fever or increasing pain, insisting on regular stops to check his splints and offer water. They reached town as dusk was falling, a crowd gathering as word spread that the search party had returned with Hugh Mackenzie, alive against all odds. Dr. Warren was waiting at his small office, having been alerted by a rider sent ahead. "Broken tibia," the doctor confirmed after examining Hugh's leg. "Clean break, fortunately." "You said it well on the mountain," he added to the blacksmith, who had experience with such injuries from his work. "He'll need 6 weeks off that leg, minimum, but should heal without complications if infection doesn't set in." 6 weeks? Hugh growled. "Doc, I've got trap lines to check, pulse to process. 6 weeks, the doctor repeated firmly. "Unless you want to spend the rest of your life with a limp." After Hugh was settled in the small recovery room behind the doctor's office, the search party members departed to their homes and much-needed rest. Elizabeth remained, helping the doctor prepare poultices for Hugh's numerous cuts and bruises. "You should get some rest too, Miss Winters," Dr. Warren suggested kindly. "You've had a difficult few days." "I'd like to stay a while longer," Elizabeth replied. "Just to be sure he's comfortable." The doctor studied her face, then nodded. "With understanding. I'll be in my quarters if needed. There's broth on the stove if he wakes hungry." Left alone with Hugh, Elizabeth sat beside his bed, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The strong mountain man looked strangely vulnerable in sleep, his face relaxed and years younger without the usual watchful expression he wore in town. "You're staring," Hugh murmured without opening his eyes. Elizabeth smiled, not embarrassed at being caught. "I'm making sure you're really here. Part of me still believes you're lost in the mountains." His eyes opened, finding hers in the lamplight. Not lost anymore. He shifted, wincing as the movement jarred his splinted leg. Elizabeth, what happens now? When I'm healed, I'll need to return to the high country. The spring pelts are the most valuable of the year. The question held more than concern about his trapping season, and they both knew it. Elizabeth considered carefully before answering. I came west looking for a future I couldn't have in Boston after the fire, she said slowly. I thought that meant becoming someone's wife, having a proper home, finding security. But I've discovered something different here, work that uses my skills, people who value me for my abilities rather than pity me for my scars. She paused, gathering courage. And I found you. I don't know what that means yet, but I'd like the chance to find out. Hugh reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. I've lived alone in these mountains for 10 years, Elizabeth. Never thought I needed anyone else. Then you walked into my cabin and started putting everything in its proper place, including, maybe, me. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. I can't offer you a fancy house in town or the kind of life Blackwood might have given you. My home is a cabin in the high country for half the year. But if you wanted to share it. The question hung unspoken between them, breathtaking in its simplicity and its enormity. Elizabeth thought of the path that had brought her here. The fire that had scarred her face but spared her life. The journey west to a marriage that had dissolved before it began. The unexpected employment with a mountain trapper that had led to this moment of possibility. I would need to learn many things, she said thoughtfully. How to track game, identify plants, survive winter in the high country. I'm a good teacher, Hugh replied, hope kindling in his eyes. And you would need to learn things too, Elizabeth continued. Patience with my mistakes, understanding when I need civilization occasionally, acceptance that I might bring books and proper accounts even to a mountain cabin. A smile spread across his bearded face. Already started learning those lessons, I think. Elizabeth leaned forward, her scarred cheek catching the lamplight. And this? These scars that made another man reject me on sight, they don't trouble you? Hugh's free hand rose to touch her face, his fingers gently tracing the ridged skin with a tenderness that made her breath catch. These show me you're a survivor, Elizabeth. Same as the scars I carry from 10 years in the mountains. Marks of living through hardship, not reasons to turn away. The simple acceptance in his touch broke something open inside her. A wall, built of rejection and self-doubt, that had been constructed stone by stone since the fire. Elizabeth leaned into his hand, tears slipping down her cheeks. Then yes, she whispered. I want to learn what we might become together, whether in town or in the mountains. Hugh's smile deepened, crinkling the corners of his eyes. Good, because I'm not sure I could go back to living without my bookkeeper now. Elizabeth laughed, the sound bright with relief and newfound hope. Is that all I am to you, your bookkeeper? His expression grew serious, though his eyes remained warm. No, Elizabeth. You're the woman who saw value in a rough mountain man when others saw only a wild creature. You're the one who brought order to more than just my accounts. His voice dropped lower. And if I weren't laid up with this broken leg, I'd show you exactly what else I think you are. The promise in his words sent heat rushing to her cheeks. Perhaps it's for the best that you need to heal first, she teased gently. We have time now to learn each other properly. As if to seal their understanding, Elizabeth leaned down and pressed her lips to his, a first kiss that held both question and answer, tentative yet filled with promise. Hugh's hand moved to cradle the back of her head, holding her close for a moment before releasing her. Worth breaking a leg for, he murmured, his eyes never leaving hers. Dr. Warren's prediction proved accurate. Hugh's recovery required 6 full weeks of limited mobility. What could have been a frustrating confinement for a man accustomed to roaming the mountains freely became instead a period of unexpected discovery for both Hugh and Elizabeth. She visited daily, initially bringing meals and helping with his business correspondence. But soon their time together expanded beyond practical necessities. Hugh taught her to identify different furs by touch alone, to understand the mountain weather patterns, to read tracks in fresh snow. Elizabeth introduced him to favorite books, improved his rudimentary writing skills, and helped him draft a business plan that would allow for more time in town without sacrificing his trapping income. The people of Silver Creek watched their developing relationship with a mixture of curiosity and cautious approval. The scarred Eastern woman and the mountain trapper made an unconventional pair, but there was something fitting about their unlikely partnership that even the most judgmental townspeople found difficult to criticize. "Never seen Mackenzie talk so much in all the years he's been coming to town," the general store owner remarked to his wife. "Miss Winters has tamed him somehow." "Not tamed," his wife corrected thoughtfully, watching the pair through the shop window as Elizabeth helped Hugh navigate the boardwalk with his crutches. "She's given him a reason to come down from the mountain. Different thing entirely." James Blackwood avoided them assiduously, crossing the street whenever he saw Elizabeth approaching. His rejection, which had once devastated her, now seemed like a distant memory, a painful but necessary step on the path that had led her to Hugh. As winter deepened around Silver Creek, Elizabeth made her own preparations for the future. She arranged with Mrs. Keller to maintain her room at the boarding house during the months she would be in the high country with Hugh, ensuring she would have a place in town when they returned. She studied Dr. Warren's medical texts, learning treatments for common injuries and illnesses that might occur far from professional help. Most importantly, she began accompanying Hugh on short excursions into the foothills as his leg healed, testing her endurance and building the strength she would need for mountain living. Their first real test came in February, when Hugh was finally pronounced fit enough to check his nearest trap lines. The day-long journey would take them several miles into the mountains, requiring an overnight stay in one of his lime cabins before returning to town. "You don't have to come," Hugh told her as they prepared for the trip. "The cabin is primitive and the trail will be challenging." "I need to know if I can do this," Elizabeth replied, packing the supplies she had carefully calculated for their journey, "for both our sakes." The trail was indeed challenging, steep in places, with ice lurking beneath the snow and biting wind that found every gap in their clothing. Elizabeth struggled at times, unused to the physical demands of mountain travel and the effects of altitude. But each time she considered asking to turn back, she would look ahead to where Hugh moved with the easy confidence of someone in his natural element, and find renewed determination. When they finally reached the lime cabin, a sturdy one-room structure built of logs with a stone fireplace, Elizabeth was exhausted but triumphant. She had made it, proving to herself and to Hugh that she could adapt to this new life. "You did well," Hugh told her as they warmed themselves by the fire he had quickly built. "Better than I expected for your first real mountain journey." "I'm stronger than I look," Elizabeth replied, unpacking their supplies with hands that trembled slightly from exertion and cold. Hugh's expression softened as he watched her. "I never doubted your strength, Elizabeth. It's not your body I was concerned about, but whether you would find happiness in this kind of life. There's beauty in the mountains, but also isolation and hardship." Elizabeth paused in her work, considering his words carefully. "The isolation doesn't frighten me. After the fire, I lived surrounded by people, yet utterly alone, pitied, avoided, defined by my scars rather than myself. Here, with you, I feel seen for who I truly am." She gestured to the simple cabin around them. "This may not be the life I imagined for myself, but perhaps it's the life I was meant to find." Hugh crossed the small space between them, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "Then I'm the fortunate one," he said simply, "to have found you when I wasn't even looking." Their kiss this time held none of the hesitancy of their first. It was a promise, a commitment, an acknowledgement of the path they had chosen together. Outside, snow began falling again, isolating their small cabin in a world of white. But inside was warmth, understanding, and the certainty that sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to exactly where one belongs. As they prepared for sleep, later that night, sharing the cabin's single narrow bed with propriety maintained by layers of blankets and clothing, Elizabeth found herself thinking of the long journey that had brought her to this point. The fire that had scarred her had also set her on a path west, where rejection by one man had led her to another who saw her true worth. "What are you thinking?" Hugh murmured beside her, his voice heavy with approaching sleep. "That sometimes what seems like punishment becomes a gift," she replied softly. "If James Blackwood hadn't rejected me, I would never have found you." Hugh's arm tightened around her waist. "His loss," he said simply. "My gain." As she drifted toward sleep, Elizabeth remembered the mail-order bride advertisement that had first caught her eye in Boston, promising a new life in the West for a suitable woman willing to leave the past behind. The life she had found was nothing like what that advertisement had promised, yet infinitely more valuable for its authenticity. Her scars, once a mark of tragedy and rejection, had become instead the first chapter in a story of unexpected beauty. A story still being written in the shadow of mountains that had claimed a solitary trapper and the scarred schoolteacher who had found in each other exactly what neither knew they were seeking. Spring came to the Colorado mountains in fits and starts, warm, sunny days followed by bitter snowstorms that reminded everyone winter wasn't fully vanquished. By early April, the highest peaks still wore their white crowns, but the valleys and lower slopes had begun to show the first tender green of new growth. For Elizabeth Winters, the changing season brought a profound shift in her life. She stood now at the doorway of Hugh Mackenzie's mountain cabin, their cabin, watching morning mist rise from the valley below. 3 months had passed since their overnight journey to the lime cabin. 3 months of careful preparation and thoughtful decisions that had led to this moment. "Second thoughts?" Hugh asked, joining her in the doorway, a steaming cup of coffee in each hand. Elizabeth accepted the offered cup, letting its warmth seep into her fingers. "Not second thoughts, just awareness of how far I've come, in every way." The cabin perched on a natural shelf halfway up the mountainside, offering breathtaking views of the valley where Silver Creek nestled among pine forests and meadows. Unlike the utilitarian line cabins used during trapping season, this was Hugh's permanent home, sturdily built with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that caught the morning sun. Simple but comfortable, it reflected its owner's practical nature and appreciation for natural beauty. They had been married 2 weeks earlier in Silver Creek's small church, a ceremony attended by the handful of people who had become Elizabeth's friends in the frontier town, Mrs. Keller, Dr. Warren, Sheriff Donovan, and the search party members who had found Hugh in the winter storm. Reverend Hayes had performed the ceremony with evident surprise that the scarred mail order bride rejected by James Blackwood had found happiness with the town's most reclusive resident. "You're not what I expected as a mountain wife," Hugh observed, his shoulder brushing against hers in the doorway. "Most trappers who marry take local women, daughters of settlers or miners who grew up in these conditions. Are you concerned I won't manage?" Elizabeth asked, though without real worry. They had discussed this many times during the winter months. Hugh shook his head, his beard now neatly trimmed as one of many small compromises they had navigated. "Not concerned, grateful. You chose this life with open eyes, knowing its challenges. That means more than someone who never knew anything different." Elizabeth sipped her coffee, considering his words. "We both chose, Hugh. You could have continued your solitary existence. Instead, you opened your life to include me." His arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. "Best decision I ever made." The transition from town to mountain living had not been without challenges. Elizabeth had spent the winter months learning essential skills: how to maintain a fire through the night, preserve game meat, identify edible plants, and handle the rifle Hugh insisted she master for protection during his absences. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, now showed calluses and small scars from practical mountain tasks. Yet for every skill Elizabeth acquired, Hugh had made his own adaptations. The cabin now boasted bookshelves filled with volumes ordered from Denver, a proper desk where Elizabeth maintained their improved business records, and curtains at the windows that added a touch of civilization to the rustic dwelling. He had expanded the small kitchen garden into a larger plot where Elizabeth could grow herbs and vegetables during the short mountain growing season. Most significantly, they had established a rhythm that honored both their needs: 6 months. In the high country during spring and summer, when trapping was less profitable but the mountains offered abundant food and milder weather. 6 months in town during fall and winter, when Hugh could check his trap lines while Elizabeth maintained connections with the community and civilization she still valued. "I need to check the South Ridge line today," Hugh said, finishing his coffee. "The spring melt will have uncovered the markers. Want to come along?" Elizabeth nodded eagerly. These day journeys into the surrounding wilderness had become one of her unexpected joys, opportunities to see the natural world through Hugh's knowledgeable eyes, to learn the subtle signs and patterns that had allowed him to thrive where others merely survived. They set out after breakfast, following a narrow trail that wound upward through pine forests where patches of snow still lingered in shaded hollows. Hugh moved with the easy, ground-covering stride of someone born to mountain travel, but he adjusted his pace to accommodate Elizabeth's still developing stamina. She had learned to read the landscape as they traveled, noting landmarks, watching the sun's position, observing the changes in vegetation that marked different elevations. "Look there," Hugh said softly, pausing to point toward a sunny clearing. "Ahead, someone's watching us." Elizabeth followed his gaze to see a magnificent elk standing at the forest edge, its massive antlers still in velvet, regarding them with dignified curiosity. As they watched, motionless, a female and calf emerged from the trees to join the bull. "They're beautiful," Elizabeth whispered, awed by the creature's grace and power. "Food on the hoof," he responded practically, though without reaching for his rifle. "But not today. Too early in the season, and they have the calf." This balance between pragmatic survival and respect for the natural world was something Elizabeth had come to appreciate about her husband. Hugh took what he needed from the mountains: furs for trading, meat for eating, timber for building, but never more than necessary, and always with awareness that his existence depended on the continued health of the wilderness around him. They continued their climb, eventually reaching a ridgeline where stone cairns marked the boundary of Hugh's primary trapping territory. As he had predicted, the spring melt had caused some to tumble, and they spent the next hour rebuilding the markers, Elizabeth gathering suitable stones while Hugh reconstructed the cairns with practiced hands. "Why are these boundaries so important?" Elizabeth asked, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cool mountain air. "There's no one else trapping these ridges, is there?" "Not yet," Hugh replied, setting the final stone on a newly rebuilt cairn. "But the territory's changing. More settlers coming west each year. Won't be long before other trappers push into these mountains. When they do, they'll see these markers and know this area is claimed." Elizabeth looked out over the vast wilderness spreading below them. Endless forests, hidden valleys, peaks still wearing winter snow. It seemed impossible that such boundless space could ever become crowded, yet she knew from her Eastern upbringing how quickly civilization could transform landscape. "Is that why we're teaching the Washburn boy your trapping methods?" she asked, referring to Jamie, Mrs. Keller's nephew, who had shown interest in learning the mountain trade. Hugh nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Boy has good instincts. Respects the mountains. Better to pass on knowledge to someone who'll use it properly than have these ridges overrun by greenhorns who'll trap a territory bare in one season. This forward-thinking approach was another aspect of Hugh that had surprised Elizabeth. Beneath his seemingly simple exterior lay a mind that considered consequences and planned for possibilities others might not foresee. He understood change was inevitable and chose to shape it rather than merely resist it. They ate a simple lunch of jerky, hard cheese, and dried fruit while sitting on a sun-warmed boulder with views that stretched to the horizon. Eagles soared on thermals above them, and somewhere in the distance, they heard the distinctive bugle of another elk. "I never imagined such peace existed," Elizabeth commented, leaning back to feel the sun on her face. In Boston, there was always noise, carriages, vendors, neighbors. Even in Silver Creek, you can hear the mine machinery and saloon pianos, but here, it's not always peaceful, Hugh reminded her. Winter storms can shake this ridge like God's own fury. Summer brings lightning that can split trees clean in half. Nature has its own kind of noise. Yes, but it's different, Elizabeth insisted. Even in its violence, there's purpose here. Nothing wasted, nothing meaningless. Hugh studied her with thoughtful eyes. "You're becoming a mountain philosopher, Elizabeth Mackenzie." She smiled at the name she was still growing accustomed to. "Perhaps, or perhaps I'm finally finding words for things you've known all along." The comfortable silence that followed was one of the gifts of their relationship, the ability to sit together without need for constant conversation, each secure in the other's presence. As they began their descent in the afternoon, Elizabeth noticed Hugh watching her with unusual attention, studying her movements on the steep sections of trail, offering his hand more frequently than typical. "What is it?" she finally asked after he insisted she rest on a fallen log halfway down. "You're treating me like I might break. I'm stronger than I was in winter." Hugh's expression held a mixture of concern and something else, a protective tenderness she hadn't seen before. "You're pushing yourself hard today. The altitude affects people differently." "I've been living at this altitude for weeks now," she pointed out reasonably, "and I've made this climb before." He hesitated, then asked with careful neutrality, "When did your monthly cycle last come, Elizabeth?" The question caught her completely off guard. Elizabeth opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again as she calculated backward. With widening eyes, she realized it had been nearly 6 weeks, unusual for her typically regular pattern. "I've been so busy with the move to the cabin, I didn't notice," she said softly, one hand drifting instinctively to her abdomen. "Do you think?" "I think," Hugh said gently, "that my mother complained of the same fatigue when carrying my younger brothers. Said the mountain air made it worse early on." The possibility stunned Elizabeth into momentary silence. They had discussed children, of course, but as a future consideration, not an immediate reality. The practical implications cascaded through her mind: a baby born in the wilderness, miles from proper medical care, her limited experience with infants, the challenges of raising a child in such isolation. Hugh watched the emotions play across her face, then sat beside her on the log. "We can return to town if you're concerned. Dr. Warren could confirm it." Elizabeth shook her head slowly, emerging from her initial shock. "No, not yet. I want to be certain before we change our plans." She looked up at him, suddenly anxious. Would you be pleased? If it's true." The smile that transformed Hugh's weathered face answered before his words. "More than pleased, Elizabeth. Honored, amazed." His large hand covered hers where it rested on her stomach. "But also determined that you and the child have everything you need, wherever that might lead us." The tenderness in his touch and voice melted Elizabeth's momentary fears. This man who had survived a decade alone in the wilderness, who could track game across rocky terrain and face down mountain storms, was looking at her with awe at the prospect of creating new life together. "Let's wait a few weeks to be certain," she said, practical despite the emotion of the moment. Then we can decide what's best. Hugh nodded, helping her to her feet with new gentleness. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. That's what matters most. The remainder of their descent passed in a mixture of cautious planning and quiet joy. By the time they reached the cabin, both were mentally rearranging their lives around the possibility growing within. Elizabeth, a new adventure neither had fully anticipated when they chose to build a life together. That evening as they sat before the fireplace in comfortable companionship, Elizabeth found herself studying Hugh's hands as he worked on a small carving, a wooden animal taking shape under his skilled knife. She thought of those same hands rebuilding stone cairns on the ridge, setting traps with precise care, touching her face with tenderness that belied their strength. "What would you want?" she asked suddenly. "A son or a daughter?" Hugh looked up from his carving, considering the question with typical thoroughness. "Either would be a blessing," he said finally. "A son to teach the mountains, a daughter to remind me of her mother's courage." He set aside his work. "What about you?" Elizabeth hadn't thought beyond the overwhelming possibility of motherhood itself, but Hugh's question sparked immediate certainty. "A child with your eyes," she said softly. "And your heart. Boy or girl doesn't matter if they inherit your way of seeing the world, finding value in what others overlook." Hugh's expression softened as he recognized her meaning. He rose from his chair to kneel before her, his hand gently tracing the scarred side of her face, a gesture that had become his particular way of showing affection. "Then we agree," he said simply. "We want a child who sees with true eyes." 2 weeks later, Elizabeth's suspicions were confirmed by her body's continued changes. The discussion of whether to remain in the mountain cabin or return to town took on new urgency as they weighed the advantages of each option. "The town has Dr. Warren," Hugh acknowledged as they sat at the cabin's small table, a map of the territory spread before them, "and Mrs. Keller, who's midwifed half the children in Silver Creek." "But the town also has gossip, restrictions, expectations," Elizabeth countered. "Here, we're free to raise our child as we choose, without constant judgment." Hugh traced the trail between their cabin and Silver Creek with a calloused finger. "It's a 6-hour journey in good weather. Longer in snow or rain, if there were complications." The unspoken concern hung between them. Both knew childbirth could turn dangerous quickly, even for healthy young women. The isolated beauty that made their mountain home so special could become a deadly trap if emergency arose. "What if we compromised?" Elizabeth suggested, studying the map. "Remain here through summer while travel is easiest. Then return to town in early fall, well before my time comes." Hugh considered this, mentally calculating dates. The baby would come in late December, by my reckoning, Elizabeth replied. "We'd already planned a winter in town. This just gives us additional reason." The plan made practical sense, allowing them to maintain their mountain existence through the pleasant summer months while ensuring Elizabeth would have proper care when her time came. Yet as they continued discussing details, Hugh sensed an underlying tension in his wife's manner. "There's something else troubling you," he observed that evening as they prepared for bed. "Something beyond practical concerns." Elizabeth sat at the small vanity table, another addition Hugh had made to their cabin, brushing her hair with long, thoughtful strokes. In the mirror's reflection, her scarred profile was clearly visible in the lamplight. "I was thinking about the child," she admitted quietly. "About inheritance." Hugh moved to stand behind her, their eyes meeting in the mirror. "You're worried the baby might inherit your scars," he said, understanding immediately. "That's not possible, Elizabeth. Your scars came from fire, not birth." "Not the physical scars," she clarified. "The others. The feeling of being different. Marked, set apart from others." Her brush paused mid-stroke. "I don't want our child to feel the rejection I've known." Hugh's hands settled on her shoulders, strong and reassuring. Our child will be born of love, Elizabeth. Raised with certainty of their worth. That makes all the difference. But the world can be cruel, she persisted. Children especially can be merciless toward those who are different. Then we'll teach our child to find strength in difference, Hugh replied firmly. To value character above appearance, substance above surface, just as we've learned to do. He gently turned her to face him. Besides, any child of ours will have your intelligence and my stubbornness. A formidable combination against the world's small minds. His confident assessment coaxed a smile from Elizabeth despite her concerns. A terrifying combination, more likely. That too, Hugh agreed with a chuckle, drawing her to her feet and into his embrace. But a child doesn't need to be ordinary to be happy, Elizabeth. Look at us, a scarred schoolteacher and a mountain hermit, hardly conventional by any measure. Yet I'd challenge anyone to find two people more content with their choices. The simple truth of his statement settled into Elizabeth's heart, easing fears she had carried since first suspecting her pregnancy. They were different, both of them marked by life in visible and invisible ways. Yet in their difference, they had found profound connection and purpose. Their child would inherit that legacy, along with whatever challenges might come. You're right, she acknowledged, resting her head against his chest. Our experiences shape us, but they don't define us. That's what we'll teach our child. The fail. Summer months passed in a rhythm of productive activity as they prepared both for the coming baby and the eventual return to town. Hugh expanded his hunting territory, securing extra meat that Elizabeth preserved through smoking and drying. She tended the garden with new enthusiasm, knowing the vegetables and herbs would support her changing body's needs. Word of their expected child reached Silver Creek through Jamie Washburn, who made regular trips to the cabin to continue his trapping apprenticeship with Hugh. The news apparently caused considerable stir in the small community. Mrs. Keller says she's already organizing baby things, Jamie reported during one visit, helping Elizabeth harvest early potatoes from the garden. And Dr. Warren's ordering special tonics from Denver. Elizabeth smiled at the town's enthusiastic response. Please thank them, Jamie. We'll be back before first snow. Reverend Hayes mentioned the baby in Sunday service, the young man added with a hint of mischief in his voice. Prayed for the child's safe arrival and proper Christian upbringing, despite unusual circumstances. Hugh, working nearby on a new cradle carved from pine, looked up with raised eyebrows. Unusual circumstances? Jamie shrugged. Think he meant living up here in the wild, or maybe. He hesitated, glancing apologetically at Elizabeth. Maybe he meant a scarred woman and a mountain man aren't ideal parents? Elizabeth finished. Gently, It's all right, Jamie. We're well aware of how unconventional we appear to others. Well, I think you're just fine, the boy declared loyally. Better than fine. My aunt says there's more real love in your marriage than in half the proper unions in town. The simple observation, offered without guile, touched Elizabeth deeply. She and Hugh had built their relationship on mutual respect and understanding, qualities that had grown naturally into love. That this authentic connection was visible, even to a teenage boy, suggested they were creating something of genuine value, a foundation sturdy enough to support a child's growth. As Elizabeth's body changed with the advancing pregnancy, Hugh watched with fascination and concern, adjusting their routines to accommodate her increasing fatigue and occasional discomfort. He took over more of the strenuous chores, insisted on afternoon rest periods, and spent evenings reading aloud from her favorite books when her eyes grew too tired for reading. "You don't need to treat me like porcelain," Elizabeth protested. One afternoon when he refused to let her help stack firewood. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, most while continuing all their normal work." "Most women aren't carrying my child," Hugh replied stubbornly. "Besides, I've seen deer does and elk cows in their season." The males stand guard, protect them from unnecessary exertion. Elizabeth laughed at the comparison. So I'm a breeding elk now? Hugh's weathered face reddened slightly. You know what I mean. It's natural to protect what's precious. The simple declaration, offered without artifice, silenced Elizabeth's objections. In Hugh's mountain philosophy, there was no contradiction between acknowledging human frailty and honoring human strength. His protective instincts came not from doubting her capabilities, but from valuing her beyond measure. By early September, with Elizabeth's pregnancy advancing toward its 5th month, they began preparations for returning to town. The garden was harvested, meat secured for the journey, the cabin carefully closed against weather and wildlife that might seek shelter. During their absence, on their final evening before departure, they sat together on the cabin's small porch, watching the sunset paint the western mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Elizabeth's hand rested on the gentle swell of her abdomen, where occasional flutters had recently confirmed the growing life within. "Will you miss it?" she asked, gesturing toward the magnificent vista spread before them. Being confined to town for so many months? Hugh considered before answering, his arm secure around her shoulders. "I'll miss certain things, the silence, the freedom, the sense of being part of something ancient and unchanging." He looked down at her hand where it cradled their unborn child. "But I'll have what matters most with me. The mountains will wait for our return. Next time we come back, there will be 3 of us," Elizabeth observed, wonder in her voice. 3 Mackenzies belonging to the mountain," Hugh agreed, satisfaction evident in his tone. A new generation learning the old ways but bringing fresh eyes. As darkness settled around them and stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of contentment. The fire that had scarred her face had seemed like the end of all her hopes, driving her west in desperate search of acceptance. James Blackwood's rejection had felt like final confirmation that her damaged appearance had destroyed any chance for a normal life. Yet here she sat, married to a man who valued her completely, carrying a child created in love, and looking toward a future rich with purpose. The scars remained, would always remain, but they had been transformed from symbols of loss to markers of a path that had led her to unexpected joy. "What are you thinking?" Hugh asked, noting her thoughtful expression in the fading light. "That sometimes what appears to be our greatest misfortune can lead us to our greatest blessing," Elizabeth replied. "If I hadn't been scarred, I would never have left Boston. If Blackwood hadn't rejected me, I would never have found you." Hugh nodded, understanding the truth of her observation. "The mountains taught me something similar. A blizzard that seems like certain death can reveal survival skills you never knew you had. A wrong turn that gets you lost might lead to discovering a valley more beautiful than any you've seen before. Life's harshest challenges reveal our deepest strengths," Elizabeth summarized, her hand finding his in the gathering darkness. "And sometimes," Hugh added, his voice soft with emotion rarely expressed, "they lead us to love we never thought to find." The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for beginning their journey down to Silver Creek. As Hugh secured the last of their provisions on the pack mule, Elizabeth took a final walk around the cabin that had become truly home during these summer months. The small rooms held memories now of quiet evenings by the fire, of learning mountain skills, of the moment they had first acknowledged the new life growing within her. "We'll return in spring," he assured her, seeing the wistfulness in her expression. "When the snow melts and the trails clear. The 3 of us, starting a new chapter." Elizabeth nodded, her hand automatically moving to her rounded abdomen where their child grew stronger each day. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it completely. As they made their way down the familiar trail toward town, Elizabeth found herself looking forward rather than back. The mountains had taught her to embrace change while honoring tradition, to find beauty in unexpected places. and to recognize that true security came not from walls and conventions, but from bonds formed through genuine understanding. Their child would be born into this wisdom, raised between two worlds, the civilized town and the wild mountains, learning to value both while being limited by neither. Like the hybrid flowers that sometimes appeared where forest met meadow, drawing strength from diverse roots, their child would inherit the best of seemingly opposite worlds. The scarred mail-order bride who had once been cast aside as damaged had found not just acceptance but celebration of her whole self. The solitary mountain trapper who had avoided human connection had discovered that the right companion enhanced rather than diminished his freedom. Together, they had created something neither could have found alone, a love built on seeing beyond surfaces to the essential truth within. As Silver Creek came into view in the valley below, Elizabeth squared. Her shoulders beneath Hugh's old coat, now altered to accommodate her changing body. Whatever challenges awaited in town, curious stares, well-meaning but intrusive advice, the constraints of civilization, she would face them with the quiet strength she had developed in the mountains. Her scars, once hidden behind veils, were now simply part of her story, a chapter that had led to unexpected joy. Ready for the next adventure? Hugh asked, his hand finding hers as they paused to look down at the town that represented one part of their shared life. Elizabeth smiled, feeling the baby flutter beneath her heart as if in answer. With you beside me, always. The first heavy snow of winter blanketed Silver Creek 3 weeks before Christmas, transforming the mining town into a glistening wonderland of white-capped buildings and smoke curling from chimneys into the clear mountain air. Elizabeth Mackenzie stood at the window of their rented cottage on Pine Street, one hand resting on her now prominent belly as she watched children sledding down the gentle slope behind the church. They look like they're flying, she observed as Hugh entered the room carrying firewood. Town children make their own fun in winter, he replied, carefully adding logs to the hearth. Though they'd learn a thing or two from the Arapaho children. I once saw sledding on buffalo hides down near South Park. Those youngsters have no fear. Elizabeth smiled, imagining the scene. In their 3 months back in Silver Creek, Hugh had shared more stories of his decade in the mountains than during all their previous time together. It was as if the approaching birth of their child had awakened memories he wanted to preserve and pass on, tales of survival, encounters with native peoples, and the harsh beauty of Colorado's wildest places. Their return to town had caused less stir than Elizabeth anticipated. Perhaps the months in between had dulled the novelty of their unusual marriage, or perhaps her advancing pregnancy had awakened the protective instincts of the frontier community. Whatever the reason, they had been welcomed with practical kindness rather than intrusive curiosity. Mrs. Keller had insisted they take this small cottage she owned rather than a room at the boarding house, declaring that new babies need proper homes, not rooms with thin walls and other boarders complaining about the crying. The rental price she named was suspiciously low, but when Elizabeth tried to negotiate a more fair arrangement, the landlady had simply waved away her concerns. "Consider it my investment in Silver Creek's future," she had said firmly. "This town needs more families with sense and backbone, not just miners passing through on their way to the next strike." Dr. Warren had immediately established a schedule of regular checks on Elizabeth's health, bringing books on childbirth from his medical training in Philadelphia and consulting by mail with a specialist in Denver. His careful attention had eased Hugh's concerns about potential complications, though the trapper still watched his wife with the vigilant eyes of a man accustomed to spotting danger before it fully materialized. Most surprisingly, a delegation of town women, led by Mrs. Warren and including the wives of the general store owner, the blacksmith, and even Reverend Hayes, had arrived one afternoon bearing handmade baby clothes, blankets, and practical advice for the new mother-to-be. "We take care of our own in Silver Creek," Mrs. Warren had explained when Elizabeth expressed gratitude for their unexpected generosity. Besides, it's not every day we get to welcome a baby whose father knows more about mountain lion behavior than proper baptism customs. The good-natured teasing had broken the ice, leading to weekly gatherings where the women worked on baby preparations, while sharing stories that ranged from childbirth experiences to frontier hardships overcome. For the first time since the fire that scarred her, Elizabeth found herself accepted within a circle of women, her differences acknowledged but not defining her place among them. Now as December deepened and her time grew closer, Elizabeth felt surprisingly calm. The cottage was prepared, with a cradle Hugh had carved standing ready beside their bed. Dr. Warren visited every few days, confirming that mother and child appeared healthy. Hugh had established a comfortable winter routine, helping Jamie Washburn check nearby trap lines during the day, returning by dusk to spend evenings with Elizabeth. Mrs. Warren brought more baby things this morning, Elizabeth told Hugh as he finished arranging the fire, including the tiniest pair of moccasins I've ever seen. Apparently her husband traded medical services to a Ute family passing through last month, and they gave these as payment. Hugh examined the soft deerskin shoes with approval. Good craftsmanship. Proper moccasins will serve a child better than stiff town shoes, especially for learning to walk. She also mentioned that James Blackwood has left Silver Creek, Elizabeth added carefully, watching her husband's reaction. Apparently he received a letter from Denver about a business opportunity and departed rather suddenly. Hugh's expression remained neutral, though a certain tension in his shoulders revealed his feelings about the man who had rejected Elizabeth upon her arrival. Denver might suit him better. More chance for social climbing there. Elizabeth crossed the room to stand beside him, her hand finding his. I wanted to dislike him forever, you know. To hold his rejection against him as a constant reminder of human cruelty. She sighed, shaking her head. But lately, I find myself almost grateful to him. Hugh raised an eyebrow in question. If he had honored our arrangement, I would be Mrs. Blackwood now, Elizabeth explained. Living in that big house on Hill Street, confined by social expectations, and married to a man who saw only my surface. Instead, her hand guided his to the rounded curve where their child moved beneath her heart. Instead, I found my way. To you, to us, to this future we're building. Hugh's weathered face softened as he felt the strong kick against his palm. Still he hurt you. Yes, Elizabeth acknowledged. But pain often precedes growth. The forest fires you've described to me destroy what exists, but also clear the way for new life to emerge. She smiled slightly, touching her scarred cheek. Perhaps that's what all my fires have done. Cleared space for unexpected blessings. Hugh's arms encircled her, careful of her expanded waistline. You've become quite the philosopher, Elizabeth Mackenzie. I've had an excellent teacher in the art of finding meaning in difficulty, she replied, leaning against his sturdy frame. A certain mountain man who sees possibility where others see only hardship. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Hugh released her reluctantly, crossing the small sitting room with the silent stride that still surprised townspeople accustomed to heavier footfalls. He returned moments later with Sheriff Donovan, whose ruddy face bore an expression of concern beneath his snow-dusted hat. Sorry to disturb you folks, the sheriff said, nodding respectfully to Elizabeth, but we've got trouble brewing. Storm. Coming in from the northwest, bigger than anything we've seen this season, according to the old-timers. I'm advising everyone to prepare for at least 3 days indoors, possibly longer. Hugh's expression grew serious. When? By tomorrow afternoon is my guess. Sky's got that peculiar color up north. The sheriff turned to Elizabeth. Mrs. Mackenzie, I know your time is approaching. Dr. Warren asked me to inquire if you'd prefer to move to the clinic until the storm passes, just as a precaution. Elizabeth and Hugh exchanged glances, a wordless communication passing between them. Thank you, Sheriff, she replied. but I believe we'll be comfortable here. Hugh has weathered worse storms than this in the high country, and the cottage is well supplied." The sheriff nodded, unsurprised by her decision. "Thought you might say that. The doc said to tell you he'll try to check in before the worst hits, but to send word immediately if you feel any changes." After he departed, Hugh moved efficiently around the cottage, checking window seals and bringing additional firewood. Inside from the covered stack against the back wall, Elizabeth watched his preparations with admiration for his calm competence. "Should I be more worried?" she asked as he filled extra lamps with oil. Hugh paused, considering her question with his usual thoroughness. "Respect for the weather is always wise, but fear rarely helps. We have shelter, food, water, and heat. The cottage is sturdy. If your time comes during the storm, we have Dr. Warren's instructions and the knowledge of every frontier woman who shared birth wisdom with you these past months." His practical assessment steadied her. This was how Hugh approached all challenges, acknowledging reality while focusing on available resources rather than potential disasters. It was an approach born of years surviving in environments where panic meant death and calm problem-solving meant life. "Besides," he added with unexpected lightness, "mountain babies have their own sense of timing. Ours might just decide to wait until the skies clear." The storm arrived with a fury that validated the sheriff's warnings. Wind howled down from the mountain passes, driving snow that quickly accumulated into drifts against buildings and buried the town's boardwalks beneath feet of white. The temperature plummeted, turning the cottage windows into delicate landscapes of frost. Despite the blazing fire, Hugh maintained day and night. By the second day, Silver Creek had effectively disappeared beneath the snow, with only chimney smoke and the occasional lantern light visible through the swirling white. Dr. Warren had made a brief visit before the worst hit, leaving additional medical supplies just in case, and assuring Elizabeth that first babies typically took their time arriving. "Nature has its own wisdom," he'd told her, packing snow from his boots before departing. "The storm will pass, and so will your waiting." On the third morning, with the storm showing no signs of abating, Elizabeth woke to a dull ache in her lower back. She lay still for a moment, assessing the sensation. Not quite pain, but a persistent pressure unlike the usual discomforts of late pregnancy. When it faded after a minute, she carefully rose from bed, trying not to wake Hugh, who had spent much of the night adding wood to the fire. Throughout the morning, the ache returned at irregular intervals, never strong enough to cause alarm, but persistent enough to capture her attention. Elizabeth moved carefully around the cottage, preparing a hearty stew for lunch while Hugh cleared paths to the woodpile and necessary house despite the continuing snowfall. By mid-afternoon, the vague discomfort had transformed into unmistakable contractions, still widely spaced but gradually increasing in intensity. Elizabeth stood by the window, watching Hugh shovel snow, and felt a curious sense of calm descend. The child they had created together was beginning its journey into the world, surrounded by a storm that reflected the wild heritage of its father's mountain life. When Hugh returned, stamping snow from his boots, one look at Elizabeth's face told him everything. "It started," he said, not a question but a recognition. She nodded. "Early stages still. Dr. Warren said first babies often take a full day or more from first signs to arrival." Hugh moved with deliberate calm, hanging his snow-covered coat by the door and washing his hands in the basin. Only the intensity of his gaze revealed his inner emotions as he gently led Elizabeth to the rocking chair nearest the fire. "Tell me what you need," he said simply. "Just your presence for now," she replied, touched by his steady composure. "And perhaps some of that willow bark tea Dr. Warren left for when the discomfort increases." As afternoon faded into evening, the pattern of Elizabeth's labor established itself, contractions gradually growing stronger and closer together, though still allowing conversation between them. Hugh moved around the cottage with quiet efficiency, heating water, arranging clean linens, and positioning lamps for optimal light. His mountain-trained senses, accustomed to monitoring weather changes and animal movements, now focused entirely on tracking Elizabeth's progression. "Tell me a story," she requested during a period of relative ease. "Something about the mountains. In winter, something to remind our child of the heritage they're being born into." Hugh settled beside her, his strong hands gently massaging her lower back where the ache was most persistent. "There's a phenomenon in the highest peaks," he began, his deep voice creating a counterpoint to the storms howling outside. "Something the old trappers call diamond snow. It happens only on the coldest, clearest days after a storm passes." Elizabeth closed her eyes, leaning into his touch as he continued. "The sun hits the fresh snow just right, and suddenly the whole mountainside is covered with tiny prisms, each snowflake catching light and breaking it into all the colors you can imagine. It's like walking through fields of scattered jewels, so bright it almost hurts your eyes. I've seen grown men stop in their tracks at the sight, rendered speechless by beauty they never expected to find in such harsh conditions. That's lovely," Elizabeth murmured, then tensed as another contraction built. Hugh continued his story, his voice remaining steady as he helped her breathe through the wave of pain. "The Ute have stories about diamond snow," he continued when she relaxed again. "They say it's the Creator's reminder that even in the coldest, darkest season, light finds ways to return to the world, transformed into something more beautiful than before." The hours passed in this pattern, Elizabeth working through increasingly demanding contractions, while Hugh supported her with his presence, his stories, and his practical assistance. When her water broke shortly before midnight, the reality of their situation crystallized for both of them. Their child would indeed be born during the storm, with only the two of them to manage whatever came. "We should prepare the bed," Elizabeth sighed, her voice strained but determined. Dr. Warren's instructions suggested that would be easiest for a first birth. Hugh nodded, helping her stand. Jamie's mother had all 6 of her children with just his father assisting, he reminded her. And Mrs. Keller delivered 3 babies for mining families before Dr. Warren came to town. "We have their knowledge to guide us." The calm confidence in his voice steadied Elizabeth as another powerful contraction gripped her. This man who could track game across rocky terrain, who had survived blizzards alone in the high country, who had found her nearly frozen in the mountains during the search for him, this man would help bring their child safely into the world. The most intense phase of labor began shortly after midnight, with contractions coming so quickly that Elizabeth could barely recover from one before the next began. Hugh remained at her side, his voice a constant anchor as he repeated the guidance they had received from Dr. Warren and the experienced women of Silver Creek. "You're doing beautifully," he assured her, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. "Strong and steady, just like you've faced everything else." Dawn was approaching when Elizabeth felt the overwhelming urge to push. The storm outside had finally begun to abate, as if nature had exhausted its fury during the long night. In the gray light filtering through frosted windows, Hugh positioned himself to receive their child, his hands steady despite the enormity of the moment. "I can see the head," he reported, wonder breaking through his composed exterior. "Dark hair, like yours." Elizabeth gathered her remaining strength, focusing entirely on bringing their child into the world. With a final, powerful effort, and a cry that seemed to rise from her very soul, she felt the baby slip free from her body and into Hugh's waiting hands. For one heart-stopping moment, silence filled the cottage. Then a lusty, indignant wail erupted as new lungs filled with air for the first time. "A daughter," Hugh announced, his voice thick with emotion as he carefully placed the squirming, red-faced infant on Elizabeth's chest. "We have a daughter." Elizabeth gazed down at the tiny, perfect face, tears streaming down her cheeks. The baby's cries softened as she felt her mother's warmth, dark eyes blinking open to experience her first glimpses of the world. Small fists waved in protest at the brightness and cold, then relaxed as Elizabeth drew her closer. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Hugh completed the necessary tasks with the same careful attention. He brought to all-important work, tying and cutting the cord as Dr. Warren had instructed, delivering the afterbirth, making sure both mother and child were clean and comfortable. But his eyes rarely left the miracle cradled against Elizabeth's heart. When the essential work was done, he settled beside them on the bed, one finger gently tracing the curve of his daughter's cheek. "She's perfect," he said simply. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, studying the tiny features that somehow combined elements of both her parents, Hugh's strong brow, Elizabeth's delicate mouth, and a determined chin that seemed entirely her own. "What shall we call her?" They had discussed names during the long months of waiting, but had reached no final decision, feeling they needed to see their child before choosing the name that would shape her identity. Hugh considered the sleeping infant, then looked up at the window where the first rays of true sunrise were breaking through the clouds after 3 days of storm. "Clara," he suggested. "It means bright or clear, like the light returning after darkness." Clara Mackenzie, Elizabeth tested the name, feeling its rightness immediately. Born in the storm but bringing clear skies with her arrival. Yes, that suits her perfectly. As if recognizing her name, the baby stirred, tiny fists stretching upward before settling back into sleep. Hugh placed his hand gently over both his daughter and his wife's hand that cradled her, creating a circle of connection between the three of them. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion rarely displayed so openly, "for this gift, for seeing value in a life with me when others saw only hardship." Elizabeth met his gaze, seeing in his eyes the same wonder she felt. "We've both given and received gifts beyond measure," she replied softly. "And now Clara will carry forward the best of both of us." The storm had fully cleared by mid-morning, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes. The town began to emerge from hibernation, with men appearing on rooftops to clear dangerous snow loads and paths being carved between essential buildings. Sheriff Donovan was the first to reach their cottage, breaking trail through shoulder-high drifts to check on those living at the edges of town. His expression shifted from concern to astonished joy when Hugh opened the door, cradling his newborn daughter. "Well now," the sheriff said, removing his hat as if entering a church. "Looks like Silver Creek has its first storm baby of the season." Word spread quickly through the small community. By afternoon, Dr. Warren had made his way to the cottage, pronouncing both mother and child remarkably healthy given the circumstances of the birth. Mrs. Keller arrived shortly after with a basket of provisions and tears in her usually stern eyes as she held the infant. "She has the look of a survivor about her," the landlady declared. "Born in the worst storm in 10 years without even a doctor present. This one will make her mark on the world, mark my words." In the days that followed, Clara Mackenzie became something of a town celebrity, her birth during the Great Storm taking on almost mythical qualities as the story spread through Silver Creek. Women visited bringing practical gifts and staying to share advice with the new mother. Men stopped Hugh on his infrequent trips to the general store, slapping his back in congratulation and offering cigars he politely declined. Even Reverend Hayes made a special visit, his usual formality softening as he blessed the child and admitted that perhaps God worked in ways that didn't always align with conventional expectations. "Your daughter has brought this community together in celebration during the hardest season," he told Elizabeth. "Perhaps that is a ministry in itself." 2 weeks after Clara's birth, on Christmas Eve, Hugh carried his daughter to the window to show her the stars appearing in the clear mountain sky. Elizabeth watched them from her chair by the fire, her heart full at the sight of this powerful man cradling the tiny infant with such gentle care. "I'm telling her about navigation," Hugh explained, noticing Elizabeth's gaze. "How the North Star stays constant while all others appear to move around it. How finding one true fixed point can guide you home through any darkness." "An important lesson," Elizabeth agreed, "though perhaps advanced for her first Christmas." Hugh smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "She'll grow into the knowledge. Just as she'll grow into understanding how her parents found each other against all odds. How love can emerge from rejection. How beauty exists within perceived flaws." He brought Clara back to Elizabeth, carefully transferring the sleeping infant to her mother's arms. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "A Christmas gift, though it seems small compared to the one you've given me." He placed a small object in Elizabeth's free hand, a pendant on a silver chain. The pendant itself was a perfect piece of clear quartz crystal, expertly wrapped in delicate silver wire of Hugh's own crafting. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said, admiring how the crystal caught and refracted the firelight. "Mountain crystal," Hugh explained. "Found it years ago in a high creek bed, kept it because something about its clarity seemed important. Now I know why." He gently touched the pendant, then Clara's cheek, then Elizabeth's scarred face in a sequence that connected all three. "It reminds me of what we've created together, something clear and true born from rough surroundings. Something that captures light and transforms it into unexpected beauty." Elizabeth felt tears gather in her eyes at the simple poetry of his gesture. This man, whom many in town still considered rough and uncivilized, possessed a depth of understanding that continually surprised her. "Help me put it on?" she asked, holding the necklace out to him. Hugh carefully fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin with familiar tenderness. The crystal settled just above her heart, catching firelight and transforming it into scattered prisms across the room. "Our own diamond snow," she murmured, remembering his story from the night of Clara's birth. "A reminder that light always returns," Hugh agreed, settling beside her and drawing both wife and daughter into his embrace. Even after the harshest storms. As Christmas Eve deepened around them and their daughter slept peacefully between them, Elizabeth reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment of profound contentment. The fire that had scarred her face had seemed like the end of hope, driving her west in desperate search of any future at all. James Blackwood's rejection had felt like final confirmation that her damaged appearance had destroyed any chance for a normal life. Yet here she sat, cradling her newborn daughter beside a husband who cherished her completely, surrounded by a community that had come to value them both for their true qualities rather than surface appearances. The scars remained, would always remain, but they had been transformed from symbols of loss to markers of a path that had led her to unexpected joy. Clara stirred in her sleep, one tiny hand escaping her blanket to curl around Elizabeth's finger. With surprising strength. In that simple grasp lay everything that mattered: connection, continuity, the promise that love could create beauty even from life's harshest circumstances. Outside their window, stars brightened in the crystal clear mountain sky, illuminating a landscape transformed by storm, yet more breathtaking for having endured nature's fury. Like the mountains themselves, Elizabeth and Hugh had weathered their own storms: physical injury, social rejection, isolation, danger, emerging not unscathed but stronger in the broken places, more appreciative of the light for having known darkness. "What are you thinking?" Hugh asked, noting her contemplative expression. "That Clara will grow up understanding something many people never learn," Elizabeth replied softly. "That what others perceive as flaws or limitations often become our greatest sources of strength. That being cast out can lead to finding where you truly belong. That sometimes rejection is just redirection towards something far better than we initially sought." Hugh nodded, his arm tightening around her shoulders. Important wisdom, he agreed. Though she learned it not just from our words, but from watching how we live. As Christmas bells began to ring from the church in town, Elizabeth silently vowed that their daughter would indeed witness that wisdom in action, every day, in a mother who wore her scars without shame, in a father who found freedom in responsibility, and in a family built not on conventional expectations, but on the bedrock of seeing and valuing each other's true essence. The scarred mail-order bride, who had once been cast aside as damaged, had found not just acceptance, but celebration of her whole self. The solitary mountain trapper, who had avoided human connection, had discovered that the right companion enhanced rather than diminished his freedom. Together, they had created not just a child but a new understanding of what constituted true beauty and lasting love. Clara Mackenzie, daughter of mountains and resilience, would inherit that legacy and carry it forward in her own unique way, born in storm but bringing clear skies, emerging from darkness to transform light into unexpected beauty, just like the crystal that now rested above her mother's heart. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.